Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. This is episode 5 in our series dealing with the events on the Rust set. We've dealt with them kind of expansively and in a kind of a global sense, and now we are zooming in, narrowing down to the timeline leading up to the events. We've dealt with a lot of the various crew members, but the one person who's kind of been absent in the story until now has been Alec Baldwin. In the previous episode, we saw that the camera crew discreetly left the set. They were kind of removed, but not without some animus. And Helena and the assistant director, Dave Halls, they were there. So although some of the crew weren't aware that the camera crew had left, Helena certainly did know, and so did the assistant director. And so they would have also been aware of the stress, of this underlying discord going on. And then you had the first setup of the day that was complicated and took longer than expected. And so Dave Halls also would have been aware of that, of those time pressures. And so we also spoke earlier of there being a very exhausting day. It was the Sunday. So around about 3-4 days earlier had been a very exhausting day. Well, this particular Thursday, they had quite a lot to get through, shooting-wise. And so that was also going to be an exhausting day. Thursday, October 21st, was a challenging day right in the middle of production. Before we deal with the events leading up to the lunch break and the lunch break itself, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Like, share, leave a comment. And let's get started. So when filming began on October 21st, Helena was right in the middle of the road in that western town set. And apparently her eyes were sort of glued to the monitor. She was just trying to concentrate. And as I said, a lot was going to need to be done, completed on this particular day. And so there she is, positioned in the middle of the road, looking at the monitor, and a crew member quoted by the LA Times said, quote, "I can't imagine what it was like for Helena to have to continue with what she did and keep a positive attitude." And so she's obviously internalized what has happened. She's lost her crew members. She's got to start from scratch with new personnel. She's lost a lot of her equipment as well to some extent. And she's now got to keep the show on the road with the personalities that are sort of around her. And Alec Baldwin's call time was 7:54 a.m. that morning, or 6 minutes to 8, right? And so he missed a lot of these things that were going on set. Something that is quite interesting is he liked to drive himself onto the set with his assistant in the passenger seat. That's also according to the LA Times. And I think one of the most valuable insights in this entire article from the LA Times dealing with the events of October 21st is this one. Quote, "The actor was a feared but respected presence on set, and crew members said the energy shifted whenever he arrived. Everyone tried to stay out of his eye line lest they be a distraction," end quote. And, you know, if you have studied Alec Baldwin, you've studied some of his altercations with journalists, you've just kind of kept your eye on him. He's certainly a volatile personality, but also he can be quite a pleasant person, quite a charming man, right? And I've no doubt that the crew around him feared and respected him. I think there was some admiration, but there's also a sense of fear that you don't want to upset him, right? And so as soon as he set foot onto the set, the energy shifted and people were probably more on their toes and more nervous and possibly more hurried and rushed. And I think, how would that apply to younger members on the set, such as Hannah and Sarah? How would that feeling of fearing this personality impact their work, right? Then filming was going to move from, remember, they just shot this difficult scene of a lot of actors and horses entering the town simultaneously, right? And that scene took longer than usual to shoot. And from there, they would now basically decamp. They would move the equipment to the wooden church, and this took place in the late morning. And they were going to do a couple of setups inside the church. And then in the afternoon, there was going to be kind of a shootout, and they were going to need smoke and pyrotechnics. So as you can see, that particular day, they kind of had their work cut out for them. And so now we're at the point where filming is moving to the church. We're at the late morning stage, and they are kind of doing a couple of setups and checking camera angles and all that kind of thing. And so they were working on an establishing shot with the lead actor. So Alec Baldwin has written the script, and he's the lead, he's the star of his show, right? He's also the producer, one of the producers. And they were working on an establishing shot of Baldwin. According to the LA Times, quote, after the last establishing shot of Baldwin was in the can, lunch was called. And an establishing shot in filmmaking it establishes the context for a scene by showing the relationship between figures and objects. It's basically just giving a sense of context and perspective, and it's often quite a long shot. It's kind of a shot at the beginning of a scene, which is kind of introducing you to what is going to happen in the next kind of couple of moments, right? So just a couple of examples of establishing shots. It could be a location, such as a famous landmark. It could be showing the time of day. It could also be showing, the inside of a room, just giving you a sense of this is where things are going to happen next. And then you could also have something establishing a context. So it could be a martial arts drill or rain falling. And so it's just giving you a sense of this is what is happening. And so in terms of Rust, what they were trying to establish was this church setting. Now, in hindsight, given the busyness of the day, I wonder whether Hannah wishes she had not gone to lunch and sort of organized herself on the set and gotten everything ready on the set, rather than going to lunch and then coming back and having to rush, not having enough time perhaps. In any event, we now move on to the lunch part of the story. So you had the actors going to the catering tent, and it's kind of probably looked like a weird situation for the caterers there and some of the staff there, because you would have actors that are still in costume, walking around with their cowboy hats, and this is inside a really big catering tent. It's got to cater for around about 100 people at least. And they've also got to be careful not to spill any of the food on their clothing. In this LA Times article, which goes into some wonderful detail, you have someone saying that, if you did spill some food on your pants, you could rub it in and hope that it passed for dirt. And in a weird sense, a cowboy film, you can get away with being a little bit dirtier kind of thing. That is part of the look, certainly for some of the characters. And so going back to the article, they say, quote, the meat of the day's filming, including a shootout that would require pyrotechnics and smoke, was scheduled after the meal break, end quote. And I don't know whether that actually includes what happened inside the church. If somebody asked you that, given everything we know about this case, would you say that the pyrotechnics and smoke, that was supposed to happen inside the church? I would have said no. We are going to be dealing with the script itself in an upcoming episode, and we'll answer that question. But the point is that there was going to be a big shootout that afternoon, and the events in the church immediately preceded that. And so you might ask, where was Hannah and what was Hannah doing, if she wasn't in the church? And we still need to finalize exactly where she was and what was going on. But it does appear, certainly at this point, that she was doing her work as an armorer loading rounds, checking guns, whatever, because of this huge scene following the scene in the church. Does that make sense? So I think we can see why the armorer had her work cut out for her that afternoon and was perhaps tempted or pushed to rush. And so now we're going to the after lunch period. According to the article, quote, after the meal, property master Sarah Zachary retrieved the guns that would be needed for the scene from a truck where the weapons were stored inside a locked safe. The ammunition was also in the truck but had been left unsecured on a cart during the break, according to a search warrant affidavit filed by the Santa Fe County Sheriff's Office on October 27th, 6 days after these events. And so the article also points out this whole idea of authenticity. Quote, Baldwin had taken pains to make his gun work look realistic. A few days earlier, he'd gone into the church to walk through what it would be like to use the weapon in the scene. The live rounds he fired contained blanks, but still made enough noise that crew members were startled. And so that is certainly something I didn't know about, was that he had gone into the church on a prior occasion. He'd fired inside the church on a prior occasion, and these live rounds were blanks. To me, I don't really understand that statement that you have a live round that's a blank, but I guess what it could mean is a live round where the actual bullet casing has been emptied. In other words, it's sort of a round that is how can I put it, semi-active. When you discharge it, there is going to be a sound and there is going to be kind of a mini explosion, right? And so that, I think, can be differentiated from this idea of a complete dummy round where nothing happens when you pull the trigger. And so Baldwin had been in that situation before, where he discharged blanks that could discharge inside the church on a prior occasion. And so if this information is true, I think it should be contrasted to this idea that he was in the church and he was going to show no initiative and the cinematographer was going to tell him exactly what to do, and there was no way he was going to pull the trigger because he wasn't supposed to do that. Well, this scenario that had happened before, that had predated the actual tragedy, seems to put things in a totally different light, doesn't it? So according to the article, there was a camera technician who said that Alec Baldwin was concerned about safety on set, and he apparently wanted to know where this particular technician would be standing when he drew his gun, and he said, well, I'm going to be standing in a different place, and Baldwin apparently said good, for what that's worth. But you seem to have this camera technician certainly taking Baldwin's side in terms of safety. Going back to the article, quote, that Thursday, the crew began preparing for the scene before Baldwin had returned from his lunch break. So Baldwin is still on his lunch break. The crew seemed to return earlier, and one of them was Hannah Gutierrez Reed. She entered the church with the firearms. She performed a safety check with the Colt 45 in front of Halls, apparently, and then he thought at that time that he saw 3 rounds inside the gun, but he didn't check them before taking the weapon in his hand. And apparently Halls told investigators that he should have checked all of them, should have checked all of the rounds, but didn't, and he couldn't recall if Hannah spun the drum. That's according to the affidavit. And at this point, the armorer left the church. And so in this story, I don't know if Baldwin actually encountered Hannah inside the church that day, or that certainly after lunch. And so Baldwin's assistant, essentially, the person who was handing him the gun and assuring him of safety, isn't it true that that could only have been the assistant director, Dave Halls? Going back to the article, quote, no stand-in performers were on site, so the first assistant director ran through Baldwin's blocking himself, pulling the gun 3 times. Russell, a B-cam operator, watched the action unfold from a monitor on his dolly. Hutchins stood over his shoulder, flanked by Sousa, end quote. Now, in this particular situation with the assistant director basically demonstrating this, you could actually have had a fatal shooting and somebody else, if he'd really taken it to the nth degree and pulled the trigger, you could have had somebody else injured. It could even have been Baldwin. And so this is the situation according to the LA Times. Quote, because of the walkout, the team was working with fewer monitors than usual. So not just fewer cameras, there's just one camera instead of two, but also fewer monitors. And so the 10-inch screen in Video Village wasn't great quality, so the filmmakers opted to review the optics on the Dolly's monitor, and this is inside the church, which was 7 inches but at higher resolution. So what's happening here is because of the walkout, and because there are fewer monitors, there's now the need for more people to be inside the church than there otherwise would have been. That's the direct result of these crew members leaving. Going back to the article, quote, during this scene, Baldwin's character was supposed to fast draw his weapon and shoot at a rival. Halls had not pulled the gun's trigger during the run-throughs he performed. But when Baldwin entered the church to do a quick rehearsal, he apparently did. He apparently did pull the trigger. And this is a big question, is why was the trigger pulled? And you might say he didn't pull the trigger, but why in effect did the shot go off? And do you notice there's a kind of a discrepancy here where I think the script supervisor said he was never supposed to fire that gun, and in this particular article they're saying he was supposed to fast draw his weapon and shoot at a rival. So what is the correct information? And we're going to deal with that when we deal with the script for the inside of the church. We'll be dealing with the shooting inside the church in the next episode. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.